I have finally finished my review of the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. The question is it a worthwhile upgrade over the 4K or 6K? Let's find out. Hello, my name is Jonathan Palfrey and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe as always, because you know I'll probably forget to do it at the end. Today we are finally reviewing the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. Now I've had this camera since the release date. I ordered it within minutes of it going on sale. So I really want to get it as soon as possible. I've used it quite a bit in the meantime, and I've got some big shoots coming up where I'll be using it loads too. However, I think now I've finally got to that point where I can review the camera, all of its great features, all of its faults that you need to be aware of, and whether it's worth purchasing over the 4K or the older 6K. Now first off, a little bit of background before we get deep into this review. And we've been using the Pocket 4Ks for quite a while now. We ordered them when they first came out. It was quite a delay before receiving, but we got our first one. We loved it so much that we actually went out and bought a second one. And it's been our main camera of choice for doing resort shoots and traveling around the world with, mainly because of the compact size and that just incredibly good image quality, especially for the price. I mean, even if it wasn't for the price, even if there was another camera out there of that size that could shoot RAW in such an efficient way, in such a good quality way, we would probably purchase it. That said, there were always some major flaws with the Pocket 4K. And when they brought out the 6K, we looked at it briefly, but to be honest, the resolution wasn't the thing that we needed more of. And the EF mount, although more convenient in some ways, you couldn't put a speed booster on there, so it just felt like it really wasn't worthwhile upgrade, especially at twice the price. What we really wanted to see were built-in ND filters, perhaps a viewfinder, a flippy screen, and maybe a brighter screen. They were all the issues that the 4K and then the 6K had that really let it down as a camera. And of course the battery was a big issue, which just meant you had to rig it all the time. So when the 6K Pro got announced, and you can see in my reaction video, I was excited. It has fixed all of those problems that I had with the 4K and the 6K that we never got round to buying. However, did they manage to solve all those flaws, or did they create new ones in the process? And that's what we're going to go through right now. So first and foremost, let's look at the form factor of the camera. What has changed? What has stayed the same? To be honest, nothing much on the outside has changed from the 6K. It does feel like a really nice grip, and I think the rubberization has been improved over the 4K at least. A much more grippy feel to it, and because of the 6K and having that sort of larger front to it, it does give you that sort of quite nice chunky feel when holding. It is a nice camera to handheld now. I mentioned this in the battery grip review. If you do add the battery grip on, it does make the camera quite tall and not as nice to use as when it is just as the bare camera like this. On the underside is the most obvious change with the two now screw mounts, which is great just for that extra security of ensuring your tripod plate doesn't move when it's attached, because it always happens on all cameras. They start getting loose and they start going out of line, and just by having two on there, it will just hold it tighter for a lot longer. Of course, the most striking change on this camera is the screen on the back. It now flips in two directions, so you can actually flip it down like this if you're holding up the camera up high, and of course you can flip it to the side like that, so you can actually look at it even when it's not at eye level. This makes the camera much more functional to use than before. It's something that really should have been on the 4K and definitely should have been on the first 6K. I don't know why they didn't get around to actually solving this problem, but this really does solve the problem. It's easy to adjust, but what I like is it's actually really solid. Unlike the C70, where people have been reporting of it being a very loose screen, and other cameras as well that I've used where the flippy screen can move quite easily. This is a really solid connection, and you can actually place it in a way that it almost locks in place on the back like that. And if you angle it right down to 90 degrees, which can be quite handy, you can actually brace it against your chest and still use the screen, which is really nice and just gives you that extra level of stability when you're doing handheld. The final obvious change on the camera, other than those two ND filter buttons on the back, of course, is the viewfinder. This is obviously with the viewfinder on, and it gives it a very nice sleek design. I mentioned this in the EVF review, and it's just quite incredible how they've integrated this into the camera. It's not an afterthought add-on, which you'd certainly expect when they were just redesigning the camera. They've actually managed to integrate it into the camera as if it just comes with it. I mean, you look at this and you would not know that is an optional extra accessory. So that is really quite impressive how they've managed to achieve that. If we take the viewfinder off, we see how it actually attaches, and it's got that connecting point underneath along with the screw attachment. And of course, when you get the camera, you don't get the EVF included. Instead, you just get this cover, which is already attached to the camera and keeps it very nice and slim and light. If you're using this on a gimbal, then the EVF can sometimes get in the way, especially with gimbals like the RS2. It's probably worth considering keeping this around if you do get the viewfinder. You know, don't just chuck this away as soon as you get the viewfinder, because actually sometimes taking the viewfinder off and sticking this on is so quick to do, and it might be worth doing if you're using it with a gimbal. That said, it does work with the viewfinder on, it just may get in the way from doing some more extreme movements. There is one more thing as well on the camera that has visually changed. If you open up the flap, you'll spot it, and that is the extra XLR port on the side of the camera. This of course now means you have two mini XLRs, which is great and could be useful if you're doing a multi-person interview or you just need to feed in two microphones into the camera. You still have that 3.5mm jack at the top, so I didn't really feel it was that necessary to have two mini XLRs. Obviously it will help slightly improve the sound quality. Personally though, I would have rather had, with that amount of space being used up, one large XLR. Mini XLRs are fine and quality wise they're great, but at the end of the day it still requires an adapter to use it with pretty much any microphone setup. I just do think it's easier if it could just be a full-size XLR. If you're using the Sennheiser wireless packs where you don't have to use it on a hot shoe, they just would connect directly in the side. There's just many good reasons for, I think, going for one full-size XLR. And with the fact that you've got that 3.5 for a second audio input, it wouldn't have been the end of the world if they had just had the one large XLR input rather than the two smaller ones. The other option they could have gone with the extra space, I really think would have been useful, is an SDI port. It certainly would have given a good reason for calling this the Pro model, and I think a hell of an upgrade. It may have eaten maybe a bit too much into the Ursa territory, and maybe that's why they chose against it. And I guess when you look at the competition, like cameras like the C70 or the A7S, they don't have SDI output either, so maybe it's one of those things where manufacturers feel that at a certain price, SDI shouldn't be included. That's the exterior of the camera covered. Now let's talk about the actual functionality of this camera. And first off, let's talk about battery life. This has been the big issue of the Pocket 4K and especially the 6K. With those tiny Canon batteries, they just did not last at all. And it wasn't so much they didn't last very long. If on a good day you could get 40 minutes out of one, which can be long enough sometimes. It was more the unpredictability of it. It would sometimes drop down suddenly, or when you get to 20%, it would suddenly die at any moment. It was that lack of consistency of knowing actually how long left you had on the battery. The good news is this camera has upgraded its battery choices and it's now using Sony NP-F 550 or 570 batteries. These are very cheap, very slim, easy to get hold of, and work a lot better. On this camera, if you use the Blackmagic battery that comes with the camera, then you can easily get an hour out of it. You know, especially if you're stop-start recording, and especially if you're using the viewfinder where it will save a bit of power by not using the back of the screen. It will easily go an hour, and it will consistently go up to an hour as well. The only thing I'd mention is just keep an eye out when you're ordering batteries off Amazon, for example, because they do come in different sizes. I've got one here which is 21.5 watt hours. I think the Blackmagic one is 23 watt hours. There are some out there that's only 18 though, and they will not last as long. So just keep an eye out which ones you purchase. Often they don't mention it in the description, and you'll just have to check the actual images of the batteries themselves to see what capacity they actually are. I have found with the batteries that when they start running low and the red warning light comes on in the top corner, it just keeps going. Unlike before, where as soon as you see that red warning, it was going to probably die in the next minute or two. Now you can get another 5 to 10 minutes quite easily out of it, so it just gives you that time not to panic like you did before. Do you need an external battery system now? Well, it can be helpful. I'd say if you're just doing a lot of B-roll filming with this camera and just grabbing shots here and there, then no, I think it's fine. I think the internal battery lasts long enough and it's reliable enough that you could just carry a load of these in your pocket and you could easily get through a day's shoot without much trouble. My biggest frustration with these is actually just the charging. It's just a lot of small batteries to have to charge rather than one large battery. And that might be a reason to go for a V-lock option instead. Of course, there is the battery grip, which I've once again done a review of. And this of course extends your battery life by another 2/3 as you fit another 2 batteries in there. And that is awesome. But once again, you're using lots of small batteries rather than using bigger batteries. But it is a very neat solution with not having any cables around. It does make things just nice and compact and just very straightforward. You just connect it up or screw it onto the bottom with the extra 2 batteries in, and that now suddenly gives you 3 hours of battery life, which for most cases is more than enough, especially for interviews and stuff. That will cover you with no problem whatsoever. If you've already got a 4K or 6K and you've really invested in the V-locks and you've got a setup that you really love, then perhaps maybe skip buying this for now. See how you go with just using this camera on its own or with your rig. As before, the camera shoots onto CF cards, SD cards, or via the USB-C onto an SSD, and that is awesome. And I love that kind of flexibility that you get with Blackmagic cameras, and it's no different here than before. Obviously, you are shooting 6K, so you've got to be aware of the limitations of the card that you're using. So some SD cards will probably struggle to record 6K at all. But of course, those T5 and T7 SSDs from Samsung also work great, and I'm sure there's many other manufacturers that work well too. Now, speaking of those 6K files, it is the same as the Pocket 6K. So if you've got a 6K, you're not going to see any sudden image improvement by buying this camera over the one you already have. It's very, very good. And there's plenty of reviews out there that have already shown you how amazing the image quality of this camera is. I mean, I thought the 4K image quality was incredible. And this just takes it to another level again. That 6K image just gives you that extra detail. And more importantly, it kind of gives you a much more finer grain. And that's really nice. The biggest flaw I would say with the image quality of the 4K was sometimes the grain could be a bit large and be noticeable on camera. Because of the finer grain, especially if you're exporting to say 1080p, it basically cleans up the image really nicely because of how fine it actually is. Now, I found focusing with the 4K really easy. The peaking was really obvious to see, and straight away on the back of the large screen, you could see where you needed to keep in focus. With the 6K, it does feel a bit tougher, and maybe it's just because of that 6K and being critically sharp is a little bit tougher, but peaking does struggle because of that larger sensor. It's a lot smaller when actually the peaking comes up when something's in focus, so it just slows you down slightly when looking and checking on the focus using peaking. So maybe it's better to use things like the zoom in function just to check that you have actually got focus. Some people have said the footage on this camera looks quite noisy at low ISOs. I've looked at it all and I've got to say it looks great. I've not noticed any noise issues whatsoever. And actually when I've looked at it with the smaller grain of the 6K, it looks sharper and cleaner to me than what the 4K ever did. Of course, a brand new feature on the inside is those ND filters, which is absolutely incredible and such a useful addition to this camera. You've got 2, 4 and 6 stops of ND, and it's just so easy to use by just pressing the button on the back. Unfortunately though, it's not all good news when it comes to the ND filters. Of course, they're really useful and they're more than strong enough to keep your shutter angle at 180 degrees and then shoot with quite a wide open aperture even in full sun. However, there is a problem where there is definitely a color shift going on when you're using either 4 or 6 stops of ND. 2 seems fine, 4 and 6 is where you see the issue. Now, I'm not sure if this is an infrared pollution issue, which is a common fault of Blackmagic cameras, where we've seen this before with certain ND filters. Blackmagics have never had a very strong IR filter built into them for whatever reason, and it's the same here. It's got the same problems that other Blackmagic cameras have had, but of course now you've got those built-in ND filters, you would hope they would have had IR filters built into them, but it seems like they don't, and there's definitely a shift in the color. When looking at 2, 4 and 6 stops, there's definitely quite a strong blue shift. It is frustrating that it is there, and it is fixable in post, especially when you're shooting RAW. I found if you adjust the Kelvin by about 1,000, so up to 6,500 in daylight, suddenly it looks about the same. So it's not a problem that can't be overcome. It's just one of those small flaws which makes using the camera, and especially when editing with the footage, a little bit more frustrating. Now I presume it is the IR that's causing the problem, and one solution is to get an IR filter on the front of the lens. That is one way to fix things, but of course that's frustrating to have to put more filters on the front of the lenses when the whole point of having built-in NDs is to get away from all of that. I do wonder if this is something that could be solved in a firmware update. That would be probably the simplest solution. I can understand why people would be against that because effectively the camera's giving a false reading. But in reality, there is that shift going on there and there needs to be some solution to that. One way I say is doing it in post, another way maybe with those IR filters, or hopefully maybe something that Blackmagic can fix with software. Another flaw with the camera people have been seeing is with the screen on the black and that blue tint that seems to be appearing on certain cameras. Now it's not appearing on everyone, so it seems to be a calibration issue coming out of the factory where some monitors look absolutely fine while others have quite a strong blue tint. Mine has a slight blue tint and it's quite frustrating. Luckily Blackmagic are aware of the issue and they say they are going to provide a screen calibration option in a future firmware update. Hopefully we don't have to wait too long for it. It has already been quite a while since they mentioned that they would fix it. We'll see how well it does the job, but I think it will be the solution and I think it will give us a nice image on the back of the screen once they have brought it out. The actual screen itself is incredible. It's super sharp, just like the 4K and the 6K. It's a full HD screen and it just puts all the other screens from other manufacturers to shame, really. Just having a built-in screen that's that large and that sharp is a massive bonus for this camera over the competition. But this camera takes it one step further with its 1500 nit display, and it is bright. It is really bright. When you compare it to the Pocket 4K and 6K screen, it's much more viewable in daylight. As you can see here in this footage where I just compared the two, these are both set to 100%. The Pocket 6K Pro there, clearly you can see the screen in direct sunlight. So that's direct sunlight hitting the back of the screen and it's still viewable without much trouble. The 4K, however, is really tough to see. It's good enough and it's actually comparable to nearly every other manufacturer's screen where you can just about see the menus and get two things, but you really don't want to be using that as your main screen out in direct sunlight. You're going to probably want to use an external monitor if that's the case. The great thing about this one, it is so bright, it's so sharp that you can definitely use it on its own without having to use an external monitor. I've mentioned this a lot before in my EVF review, but this EVF is a really worthwhile add-on in my opinion. Some people don't like using EVFs, they've grown up not using them. I came from an EVF background, so I much prefer using them. I think it just makes it easier to stabilize the camera when shooting handheld. And because of its wonderful form factor, I just think it's just so well integrated and gives you such a nice solid point of contact. It's well worth it. It's good color actually on the EVF as a quick mini review here, and it actually is nice and sharp and easy enough to use. All the functions work really well. You can see it highlights which functions you're activating currently, so if you switch on ISO you can see that lit up. So it's definitely a worthwhile consideration if you're going to be purchasing the Pocket 6K Pro. Now if you want more details about the image quality and the file formats and all that, there are plenty of Pocket 6K reviews out there which have already explained all of that. All that sort of stuff is identical with this camera, so you're not really seeing any changes whatsoever. So all in all, you'd have to say this is a hell of an upgrade over the 6K and the 4K. But it does bring up the question, should you upgrade? And to be honest, I think it's an interesting one because it comes down to a few questions over actually what you need this camera for. The 4K is incredibly good value for money. It's still only £1,000 here in the UK. And to be honest, that's just hard to beat. Like, there's no question that in terms of value for money, the Pocket 4K is still king. There are still things I prefer about the Pocket 4K. Yes, it has got that smaller sensor, but you can speed boost it and actually gives you a bigger field of view than what you've got in this. There's other things as well. If you want to shoot 120 frames per second in 2.6K, for example, on the 4K, the jump between 4K and 2.6K is a lot smaller in terms of the crop factor. So you're not losing as much of the image when you want to do 100 frames per second. Whereas if you're using this camera and you want to go to those higher frame rates, it's a hell of a crop to go down to. Finally, it's the file sizes. 6K is wonderful, but no one needs it, let's be honest. Especially I think if you're in this price bracket, and that's where this gets really confusing. I would have actually preferred a 4K version of this camera. You know, a Pocket 4K with these upgrades would have been perfect for me. There was a reason why I went for the 4K in the first place and didn't upgrade to the 6K, and that is because of those file sizes. The extra resolution is really nice, that finer grain is really nice, but to be honest, I think for a lot of shoots it's not worth it, and it actually causes more headaches. Double the file sizes in already a large file format such as Blackmagic RAW is really tough to deal with, especially if you're running a small production company or you're a one-man band or you need to send footage to other people. And that's where I think actually there are maybe other options that might be better out there for you. So would I recommend this camera to everyone? I'm not sure. I think you need to know for sure why you want this camera. It's a wonderful camera over the 6K. And I think if you're thinking about buying a 6K, just get this 6K Pro. I think that's an easy choice. Over the 4K though, I think the price difference and those file sizes makes it a bit of a tougher choice between the two. If you're really quite new to filmmaking and you're just looking for a camera to start perhaps doing some small local jobs where you want to film for clients and things, then I'm not sure the pocket cameras are a really great option. They're really cheap and that's so amazing. However, dealing with them can be quite a headache, and I'm not sure you'll get the maximum out of the camera when you have to deal with all the problems, and you'll just find it frustrating to use. The Pocket 6K Pro is more a Ursa Mini G2 Mini, or a Micro perhaps, than a Pocket 4K upgrade. It's more of an option for people who want really good image quality, can handle with its issues and its various problems, but need it in a compact size, maybe to put on a gimbal, or just that they need something that they can easily travel with. I think in those scenarios, the Pocket 6K makes a lot of sense. In terms of having something that's really compact with built-in RAW, this is a hard camera to beat. That EVF is awesome, the tilting screen is a really great addition, and of course NDs make it much easier to use than before. This has been quite a long review, and I do apologise maybe for not giving a clear final answer. I'd love to say just go out there and buy this camera or don't stay away from it, but in reality it's not that black and white. This camera has incredible features, and for what it does, it's better than any other camera of what it can do well. However, it does have its flaws, it does have its limitations, and there are other options out there for certain people. So it's really down to your personal preferences what works best. I hope, however, you have found this review somewhat useful. If you have, please like this video and please subscribe to the channel so I can keep making these videos, because every subscription really does help boost the channel and means that I can make more and more of these films. Thank you for watching again. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.